Aloha. Hi, everybody, and welcome to our happy hour book club to discuss Emily Nagoski's book, Come As You Are, The Surprising New Science That Will Transform Your Sex Life. I'm really excited to share about this book. I'm kind of obsessed with it. And honestly, many of my friends who have read the book have described it as incredibly life-changing. And so if you haven't read this book, I highly recommend it. But I hope that this live will give you just some of the little like gems and takeaways that I think are so powerful. So we have a couple reflection prompts too that I'm going to share. And the first one is really just kind of to like a check-in, really just to get a sense of your comfort level. So the first question is, on a scale of 1 to 10, if 10 is super comfortable and 1 is super uncomfortable, how comfortable are you talking about sex and sexuality, and why? And there's no judgment on this, but I would love to hear, like, wherever you are on a scale of 1 to 10, drop in the comments. What's your comfort level? I'll share for me, I feel like I I want to say I'm at a 10, but maybe I'm at like a 9.5 or a 9 if I'm being honest, because there's always room for improvement. But I do feel like I'm very comfortable talking about this, mostly because I taught sex education in a high school. And so, to be honest, nothing surprises me anymore. I was asked all the questions. And so I got very comfortable being able to talk about sex and sexuality from sort of more of like a science perspective and like biology, just understanding our bodies, which I have to say that is what I love about this book. Like she essentially is sharing the science um, of sex and sexuality and our sexual response cycle. So, again, I really encourage you to read this book. But let's talk about, so their second question was, what was the author's goal, Emily Nagoski's goal in writing this book about women's sex and sexuality? And I think like the big thing that I took away, and she really emphasizes this throughout the book, but essentially like she wrote this book to normalize like the wide variety of women's essentially like reproductive anatomy and our sexual response cycle and mechanisms for sex, and the way that our bodies really respond to the sexual world. And so the biggest thing that she again said, she says this again and again and again, is that it's normal for women to vary and that we don't ever have to judge ourselves based on other people's experiences. So the one of her comments that she makes a lot is basically we're all made of the same parts, just organized differently. And she literally like talks you through the anatomy of it, which I think is actually really helpful. And she is a sex educator, Emily Nagoski, and she's done a ton of research around this as well. And she says, basically like most of us, and I found this to be true 100% in the work that I do with women, is that we were taught not to talk about sex or sexuality. At least that's what our culture tells us. Whether or not that's what your parents taught you, I don't know, but that's definitely what our culture tells us, is that we as women aren't supposed to talk about sex or sexuality, and yet we're supposed to be these sexual objects, basically. That's what our culture tells us. But what we know is that really like silence around these subjects perpetuates shame. And what we know is that sex itself is not shameful, right? It's actually a desire. And she differentiates that sex is not a drive, it's a desire, more than this like evolutionary drive to survive as a species. And she says that that desire is dependent basically on a number of variables that are related to our context. And in fact, I love this. So there's a quote that she says I'm going to share. She said, treat cultural messages about sex and your body like a salad bar. Love that. Take only the things that appeal to you and ignore the rest. We'll all end up with a different collection of stuff on our plates, but that's how it's supposed to work. It goes wrong only when you try to apply what you picked as right for your sexuality to someone else's sexuality. So I think that's a big takeaway, is like we need to not compare ourselves to other people and their preferences, or even, just sort of like what they've chosen at the salad bar for themselves. That it's an individual preference, really, and that each one of us, again, so we're made up of the same parts, but they're organized differently. And that the way, and so her big goal, I think, in writing this book, and my goal in sharing this book with you, is to normalize really just the variety of like sort of, again, our reproductive anatomy, but also our the way that our bodies respond to the sexual world. And so that was the biggest thing for me with this book, was it was so validating to just be reminded that there's nothing wrong with any of us, that actually, like, whatever your experience is around sex or sexuality, that that is perfectly normal. And that it actually really helps to understand what's going on in your body in order to be able to sort of improve your sex life. Um, so the third question for our like reflection prompts were, if the science tells us that basically that sex happens in a context, and that's a big thing she talks about, that sex happens in various contexts, then what sorts of things influence our, as women, our three things: our arousal, our desire, and our orgasm, right? And so those are three of the things that she talks about. And again, context plays a huge part in all three: arousal, desire, and orgasm. And she talks about basically, and these are some of the things that do get in the way when it comes to like context, and I'll talk about why in a minute. She says stress, mood, trust, and body image are central, not peripheral, central to a woman's sexual well-being. And she talks about how stress is really like, it gets in the way. It's like a sex killer, essentially. It gets in the way of our sexual response cycle if you don't complete the stress response cycle. So we have two different systems. We've got the stress response cycle and we've got the sexual response cycle. And I'm going to break down a little bit more about the sexual response cycle, but one of the things that she talks about, and honestly, she said that she got so much feedback from women that actually the part of the book that was most helpful for them was about the stress response cycle and understanding that. And that's why she wrote Burnout, which I don't know if you guys have watch that live, but that was our very first mental health book club book. So if you haven't read that book or you haven't watched the live on burnout, I highly recommend it, because I go more in depth into this. But essentially, she's talking about how our body has this dual response system when it comes to both stress and sex, and that with stress we have essentially like an accelerator and a brake. Actually, the same is true with our sexual response cycle. We have an accelerator and a brake. But with stress, she says, when we experience stress, we go into this sort of sympathetic nervous system hyperarousal. And that if we do not do something to complete the stress response cycle, then we get stuck almost in the experience of the stress. And that if we're not, sometimes we're dealing with the stressor but not the stress itself. And so that's why we have to do something that completes the cycle. That could be anything from belly laughter to exercise. Exercise, she says, is one of the single best ways to complete the cycle. But exercise, laughter, deep breathing, talking to someone, safe social connection, sleep can complete the stress response cycle. There's so many different things that actually can do that for you. But if you're not actively completing the stress response cycle, that actually is one of the biggest things that influences our sexual well-being. So again, watch the live on burnout if you want to learn more about that. I'm going to focus on the sexual response cycle today. But the last thing I'll just share, because this was a big takeaway for me from burnout, was she talks about how emotions are tunnels. And again, the idea being that like emotions have a beginning, a middle, and an end. She says you have to go all the way through the darkness, through the tunnel, to get to the light at the end. And that if we don't actually take that time to do that, then we get stuck, right? And so a lot of the work that I do with women is helping them to figure out strategies to get unstuck from their tunnels of emotion, to complete the stress response cycle so they can live their life in a more sort of optimized way, so that so that we're moving towards really like our best self, our highest potential. So one of the things though that she talks about in terms of things that what the science tells us in terms of like the context and how context influences our sexual well-being, she does have a lot in there actually where she's sharing about the impact of sexual trauma, because obviously for a survivor of sexual trauma, that there's going to be a lack of safety during sex, right? And that is a completely normal response when there has been sexual trauma. And so the body goes into either fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And, if we're fighting, then we are obviously responding in a way to protect ourselves from that stress. Um, and or if we're rather than moving towards the stressor, if we're moving away from the stressor, we might withdraw, we might go into that flight mode to escape it. But sometimes we go into freeze mode, and freeze mode means we become almost immobilized. We can't talk, we can't respond, we can't move, almost like playing dead, essentially. And that is actually a completely normal response for someone who has had sexual trauma, as is the fawn response, where basically we're like people pleasing essentially to avoid conflict. Um, and so she's essentially just, really wanting to emphasize and normalize that for a sexual trauma survivor, it is normal to perceive any sexually charged situation as threatening if you haven't yet sought treatment for your trauma. Again, last month's book was on trauma, so feel free to watch The Body Keeps the Score live. That was all about trauma and the trauma response. But she says, essentially most trauma survivors have to actively heal and rewire their nervous system response so that they can feel safe again in their body in order to then be intimate with another person. And so that is, I think, such an important takeaway of from this book. So I wanna break this down a little bit further. So she says that I was mentioning like the dual response cycle, or the dual control model, I should say, of sex, and how does that impact women's sexual response cycle? That's our fourth reflection prompt. And this is a huge takeaway from the book, because this is a really important piece, that our body essentially operates under this dual control model when it comes to sex. So similar to stress, we have an accelerator and we have a brake. So the accelerator is what she calls the sexual excitation system, or the SES. And that's the part that essentially receives sexual stimuli, and that everyone's sexual accelerator and brakes actually have different levels of sensitivity. So somebody with like a highly sensitive accelerator can be easily turned on, whereas somebody with a less sensitive accelerator, or even like, you could think of it as like a weak sexual gas pedal, takes more time, takes more sort of sexual stimulation to get warmed up, right? So that's the idea of like kind of turning on the ons essentially. And when it comes to turning off the off, so that if the sexual excitation system are the ons, the offs are the brakes, meaning she calls it the sexual inhibition system, or the SIS. And what she says is basically that this is sort of the part of us that hosts like these off signals, these neurological off signals. And if your nervous system has these easily triggered breaks, essentially, so like, for example, this could be any stimuli that comes into our sensory awareness, from a thought to a smell to a feeling, and or to the actual environment, to the context itself, that can trigger the brain to believe that sex is not a good idea in that moment. So her big thing is like, once we understand this, she even has a whole quiz on what is your sexual personality, basically, so you can understand like what are your levels of sort of SES accelerator versus SIS brake. And she's basically saying, everybody's sexual brakes and accelerators have different levels of sensitivity, and it's perfectly normal. One is not better than the other. They're all just a little bit different. She calls it, it's just essentially your unique sexual personality. And so why that's so important is that once we understand that, it's so validating to know that if you've ever been in a situation where you were just like not into it, you were not turned on, you were not wanting to have sex, there's a million different reasons that could be going on that possibly were triggering your sexual inhibition system, hitting your brakes essentially, so that you weren't really feeling it. And or somebody who has an experience where they're like constantly turned on and having a lot of sex and always feeling very sexual, maybe you have very sensitive accelerator, like your sexual excitation system is really like in check. And so again, everybody's different. There's not one way that's right and one way that's wrong, but you have to learn like how your body operates, so that then you can figure out kind of what what you might need to do or to change in terms of your context to have a different sexual experience is essentially what she's saying. So I'll give you some examples, like things that basically trigger the SES. So this is hitting the accelerator, right? Basically what she says about this is that arousal is not just a process of turning on the ons, it's also turning off the offs. So what that means is, again, she talks about desire as like everybody has a different threshold of desire, and that's affected by context, interacting with what we find pleasurable. So she talks about how desire comes in these two forms. So two things: one, spontaneous desire, and the other one is responsive desire. So spontaneous desire would be like when a person is wanting sex immediately after recognizing like a sex related stimulus. So for example, getting turned on by the scent of like a partner's smell. That would be this like spontaneous desire. Responsive desire would be like essentially being turned on, or when you experience desire in response to sexual pleasure. So like physical stimulation, kissing, touching, whatever. But two different basically forms of desire. And so if you're the kind of person who just doesn't experience that spontaneous desire, you're not constantly like turned on by things, stimuli in your awareness, there's nothing wrong with you. It just means that you may operate more under responsive desire rather than spontaneous desire. So she says the problem isn't the desire itself, it's the context. She says you need more sexually relevant stimuli that are activating the accelerator and fewer things hitting the brakes. And so that's why it's so important to figure out what's hitting my brakes, or what do I need that would sort of activate my accelerator. So that's why this, I think, is so helpful to just like normalize and validate, the range of experiences that we can have as women. Now, things that trigger the brakes, I think this is really important. So again, context, right, is everything. She says context basically dictates whether a certain sensation is pleasurable or upsetting, and therefore, by extension, it determines whether or not you and your partner have sex. So she says things that can turn off the offs are low mood, depression, anxiety, lack of self-compassion, again, stress, right? We talked about that. Risk of unwanted pregnancy, negative body image. Now, this is a huge one. So let me jump back to stress for a second, but I wanted to point this out. She says stress makes sex sound like one of the most unappealing things in the world. And she said it's important then to release our tension, release our stress, complete the stress response cycle through the things I mentioned: exercise, sleep, relaxing, talking, safe social connection, belly laughter, right, crying, yelling in a safe context, not yelling at the person, but some form of like cathartic release also can be a way to complete the stress response cycle. So stress is a big factor when it comes to context, but so is negative body image. And she talks about, I love this term. She talks about basically the bikini industrial complex. She says that's essentially the $100 billion industry that profits from like our self-criticism and our flaws, the things we believe are flaws about ourselves. And she says how you feel about your body will absolutely determine how good you feel in bed, even down to your willingness to take risks, to open up to your partner. So she says that practicing self-acceptance and improving your body image can literally save your sex life, not to mention your mental health. But this is why, right, it's so important that we learn how to practice radical self-love, that we learn how to embrace our bodies as they are. There's nothing that needs to be changed in this body, right? And if this interests you, or if this is something that you want some support with, this is a lot of what I teach, are radical self-love practices, essentially, that help you to embrace who you are on a physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual level. And so my new course that is coming out, my program, The Abounding Woman, has an entire module that's just devoted to body image and to radical self-love practices. So if that interests you, please reach out to me, or just comment Abounding Woman in the comments, and I'll get some information to you about my program, that is incredibly powerful. And also just like connecting with other women, which is a huge piece of my program. To know that we're not alone in our experiences, and there's so much healing that can come from essentially like that validation, and that being like our own insecurities being normalized by hearing other women sharing, that can be a really powerful way to begin practicing some self-acceptance. So that's, to be honest, 100% why I developed my program. But okay, so let me jump back for a second. So our fifth reflection prompt is, and this is such a big one along the lines of like body image, right? Is how does the media influence our sex lives as women? It's huge. So obviously, like we have these completely unrealistic beauty standards that make it, I think, really hard for us as women to feel sexy when we're like overwhelmed by feelings of whatever the feelings are that you have about your own body, whether it's disgust or dislike, or whatever that is. And I think that also as women, it's like this weird catch 22, because we're being one told that we're not good enough by all the advertisements and all the like companies out there, the bikini industrial complex basically that she describes. But yet we're also then taught that we're supposed to be these like sexual powerhouses by the time we turn 18. Like it doesn't make any sense. We're caught in this sort of like catch 22 where we don't quite know like who are we when it comes to our sex and sexuality. And so I think that the big idea is really that female sexuality in the media creates so many mixed messages for women, which is why I think it's so important to connect with real women who are also experiencing similar insecurities, or similar, who have, maybe just had a baby, or who have experienced challenges. Hi, Wendy. And hi, Anne-Marie. Yeah, absolutely. Jump back in here, Wendy, and rewatch if you can't watch it now. No worries. And let me see what else you're sharing. Yes, I totally agree with that. Yeah. You were sharing that French women embrace their bodies and love themselves no matter what. It is so different. The culture is absolutely so different. I think that's why women feel so comfortable, right? Like I even think about like French, nude beaches or whatever in France. I think women, it's more just like acceptable to be in this body, right? And to sort of like bear it all. And so imagine, gosh, what if you gave yourself that permission to embrace your body, to be in exactly the form that you were given, and to love it no matter what. And so one of the things that she suggests, so she has a lot of great suggestions in this book for like how to practice self-acceptance of your body. One of the things she says is to just purge the toxic media from your life. In fact, I'll mention another one of our books for anyone who hasn't had a chance to either read The Body Is Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor, or watch my live. That was like our second book club book, and it's excellent. Highly recommend it. It's all about this topic, of body acceptance, and like strategies to purge the sort of media messages that we get. But she's basically saying, like, if you're not going to actively purge some of this toxic media and the messages from your life, and like actively work to improve your body image, then you're not going to improve your sex life, is basically what she's saying. And it's going to be challenging to also improve your mental health. So she's really saying they go hand in hand. And one of the things she talks about, she assigned this actually as a homework for her college students, in the sex ed class that she was teaching I forget where she was teaching, but she encourages her students to explore their body in a mirror. She basically says, like, literally take off all your clothes and practice just exploring the anatomy of all of your body parts from a place of wonder and awe, as opposed to a place of judgment. And I think that that's such a beautiful idea, right? Because what happens when we look in the mirror? Immediately there's just like criticism that comes in. And so what would happen if we replace that criticism with curiosity and wonder and awe for this body that we've been given, right? As opposed to, oh, I should change this, or oh, I wish I didn't look that way, or oh, all that self-criticism that comes in. And so I also wanted to mention, because she has some really excellent, quotes and ideas and things around beauty and body image. But she says it's important to just note, like, not everyone who looks beautiful feels beautiful, and not everyone who feels beautiful looks beautiful, right? But everyone is beautiful, each one of us. And she says, uh, I'm just reading her quote. She says, because once more, for the people at the back, beautiful isn't something bodies should be, it's what bodies already are. And it was true about you on the day that you were born, and it's true today. And I just think there's so much truth in that, right? Like, I think about, these, like, bringing a baby into the world and how we just like adore this little chunky being. And why does that change? Why can't we embrace the roles, embrace just all of it in its like just total perfection, from the day that we're born, but like all the way through our life? Why does it change? And what I see, as a having been a high school counselor and having been working as a therapist, with teen girls and specializing with teen girls, there is this shift that happens. I think that girls tend to be fairly confident until about sixth grade. For some, actually, which is really quite heartbreaking, it says it's like fourth grade even is when some girls start to develop body consciousness. But I would say whenever like really puberty starts to kick in, there is just this self-consciousness that starts to come into play that wasn't there previously. And so how powerful if we as parents are sending messages of loving ourselves wholly and completely, as opposed to feeling like we need to change or pick at ourselves or pick at our bodies, right? What message then does that give to our children? And so the other thing she says, we don't have to be beautiful. That's already done. And we don't have to conform to the ideal, although the bikini industrial complex will reward you if you do, and punish you if you don't. She said, our task is not to change how we look or even to change how we feel about how we look. It's merely to be with our bodies, to spend a little time every now and then in a quiet space, protected from the haranguing, essentially, of the bikini industrial complex. So it's our job to turn inward, to turn toward our internal experience with kindness and compassion. And so to recognize that beauty, not the ideal, in ourselves is nothing more or nothing less than to recognize that we belong in the web of life. And when we recognize that we belong, we feel a little bit abler to hold that space and defend it, right? And she says that's exactly what the bikini industrial complex does not want us to do. But why should we see our own beauty and each other's? And I love this. She says, because the patriarchy doesn't want us to. And she talks a lot about the patriarchy, and I so appreciate that. And every time she mentions it, she has this, the patriarchy. And it makes me laugh every time I hear it. But I just really appreciate that, because she's right. And that is the message. I think when we think about like where are these messages coming from, it's coming from this like patriarchal society that we live in. So before I talk a little bit more about that, I wanted to mention one other thing. So I was talking about those three components of desire, right? We talked about arousal. We were talking about, what was the other piece of that? Arousal. Hang on. I don't even remember. Well, anyways, essentially the three different parts. Oh, here we go. I don't know where it was. Anyways, I don't know. I lost my train of thought there. Um, okay. Well, whatever. But we were talking about different things: arousal, desire, and then I think the last part was orgasm, and that was what I wanted to mention, is sort of the impact that media has on orgasm. And wouldn't it be awesome, right, if all orgasms were as mind-blowing as the media portrays them to be? Absolutely. Um, she talks about how most people think that orgasms are primarily like a genital response, but actually in reality, orgasms are really about like what's happening in our brain. And research really shows that like research shows zero relationship between our subjective experience of orgasm and our genital response. So that's important. In other words, muscle contractions can happen without orgasm, and the reverse is also true. This is called arousal non-concordance, and I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. But she basically says that despite essentially the media's like depiction of orgasms as being this like purely enjoyable, incredible thing, the way that we feel about orgasm or an orgasm depends on the context, just like other sensations. So she's saying essentially like often orgasms are pleasurable, but they also can be frustrating, they can be painful, and or they can be almost non-existent and not feel like much at all. And that is okay. That's normal, actually, is what she's saying. So regardless of like the means through which a woman experiences orgasm, which she does get into in the book in terms of like, you know, different ways that that can happen, she says there's no right way to have one, that there's no single type of stimulation that produces an orgasm that feels inherently better than another. Each orgasm just feels different, is her main message. And so she talks in the book also a lot about like why is it then that so many women seem to have difficulties with orgasm. And I don't know, you know, how many of you know that or if that's been your experience, but that is actually a very normal, common experience for women. And so what she says is that the answer is most often basically overactivation of the brakes, the sexual inhibition system, the SIS, due to negative emotions like stress, depression, anxiety, and shame. That those are the single biggest drivers that hit the brakes, that turn off the offs. And that's why it's so important to find ways, healthy ways, to complete the stress cycle and to manage your mental health, right? And that is why I'm here. That's why I created this group. Like that is really what I want to help women do, is to embody sort of your highest potential, right? The elite within you, so that you can actually feel like you're living your best life, to feel like you have these like tools in your tool belt to complete the stress response cycle, which therefore is then going to actually improve your sexual well-being as well. So one of the last things I want to talk about, second to last actually, the last question or reflection prompt was basically, what the heck is arousal non-concordance? So let's talk about that. So women are much actually more likely than men to experience an arousal response to physical stimulation. But just because you're experiencing an arousal response to physical stimulation, that does not mean the experience is enjoyable. And that is really an important point, because in the case of sexual trauma, right, many, so for example, like rape survivors feel guilt or feel shame because their vagina responded during the assault. And they might believe then that they somehow wanted or deserved what happened to them, when that is definitely not the case. And what's also true, though, is that some men also experience involuntary arousal when they're watching sexual stimuli, whether it's like pornography or a rape scene in a movie. But what's important about that is that the body can involuntarily respond to viewing or receiving sexual stimuli, but that does not mean you're a bad person. That does not mean you want to be assaulted. That does not mean you want to inflict sexual violence on other people. What that means is you are experiencing arousal non-concordance, which basically means the body is responding to stimuli in a manner that has nothing to do with your true feelings. So in other words, the body can physically respond, but the desire is not there. And that there's nothing wrong with you if that has happened. So that's a really important message. And so I sort of added in, I threw in a last question here in our live as we're wrapping up. Because this one is so relevant and so important to talk about, which not only did I address, you know, sort of like how does the media influence women's sex lives, but how does the patriarchy influence women's sex lives, right? And so what she says, so again, she talks a lot about the patriarchy, and she argues basically that patriarchy blindness, which I love that idea, contributes to burnout in women. And what she means by that, so she says one of the like major factors that plays into patriarchy blindness is what she calls human giver syndrome. Are you ready for this? This will definitely resonate with many of you. So human giver syndrome is that deeply buried, unspoken assumption that women should give everything, every moment of our lives, every drop of our energy, all to the care of other people. So quick show of hands, if that's you, drop a comment. I know I myself have suffered and struggled with human giver syndrome, although I've definitely learned how to set boundaries and come a long way with that. But she says basically like human giver syndrome is actually the framework on which sexual violence hangs. She says essentially like that basic belief that we as women are supposed to be these givers, that essentially that belief that men have a right to our bodies, and that if a woman looks attractive to a man or puts herself in a position where a man can take control of her body, for example, then that's what happens. And again, this sort of this idea that this belief then that men have a right to take what they can get, and the sad thing, which we know, is that this is not just like an emotional or a cultural dynamic, but this is literally like now a legal sanctioned reality. And that is what has been happening, obviously, in our recent news with the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And one of the things, I mean, there's so much I want to say on this, but I think because I do want to keep this again as like a safe space where we're not necessarily getting into politics, but what I want to just say is that her take essentially on how do we like shift out of this human giver syndrome. Um, Again, I really encourage you to read one or both of her books, Burnout and or Come As You Are, so that you can learn a little bit more about human giver syndrome. But one of the things she says is, what if we assumed that it was every person's moral responsibility to be generous and attentive to the needs of other people? What if we assumed that no one was simply entitled to have what they want from one another, but everyone was supposed to basically just try to help whenever they could, right? So no one, if that was our reality, no one would sit watching TV while their partner cooked dinner and did the dishes, unless both people had mutually agreed that that was what works best for them, right? Or that one should rest while the other gave, right? So she also says if that assumption that it's every person's moral responsibility to be generous and attentive to the needs of other people, then no law would allow anyone to take control of another person's body, because no one would expect that right. No one would feel, she says, the mess of doubt, betrayal, sadness, and rage that comes from being gaslit, because no one would gaslight. And she says, when anyone drops into the pit of despair, the givers who surround them would turn toward them with generous compassion without judgment. And the absence of the patriarchy then makes being a human giver safer. And so her big thing is, right, like, how do we then eliminate this patriarchy? It's challenging, but what she says is that an important survival skill, basically, for human giver syndrome is to celebrate others' rest and joy. I'm going to say that again. Basically, to celebrate others and your own rest and joy. That is her sort of solution for how we can move away from human giver syndrome, away from that framework that like perpetuates the patriarchy. Because she says the cure for burnout is not self-care, it's all of us taking care of each other. And again, that is 100% why I created this space. My hope is that this Women's Wellness Circle is a community for us to be able to support one another, to celebrate each other's rest and joy, to learn how to see rest as productive. And that is 100% what I teach my clients, really is how to, you know, when I talk about like neurohacking your brain and your body, what that means really is learning how to kind of optimize your own brain and body so that you can live at your sort of highest potential, live your life at full capacity, right? To be able to like create your own sanctuary for yourself, and then to celebrate also other women who are doing the same, and to connect with other women who are also creating their inner sanctuary, right? That is exactly why I'm here, what I'm hoping, what I do teach, what I'm hoping to teach you. And you know, you guys have probably seen this, my program, The Abounding Woman. Again, this is such an incredible, like, life transforming program that is going to teach you how to do these things, that will teach you how to embrace rest, how to like really simple, subtle tweaks, to be honest, you guys. This is not something that's going to take you hours and weeks and days and months. This is something that once you learn these skills, you have them available at your disposal, because the skills that I'm teaching are how to turn inward to really access what is already within you. And that's why it's so powerful, and that's why it's sustainable. And that's how it supports mental health in a more sort of long-term fashion. So I hope that this has been helpful for you. I hope that you've learned something about, your sexual well-being, but also hopefully about your emotional well-being, your physical well-being. If you are interested in learning a little bit more about my Abounding Woman program, I'm really hoping that we're going to get some women together on a call very soon. My hope is to hold these virtual women's circles so that we can connect with each other and really like be able to talk about all of these different um, challenges that we experience and learn that we're not alone, right? Like to create that sisterhood, that is honestly one of the most powerful things that I saw and witnessed within the last cohort of Abounding Women. The course that I ran was those weekly women's circle gatherings. Like that was part of the transformation. And so if that interests you, please let me know. If you haven't watched any of the other happy hour book club lives, they're all under the guide section of our Facebook group. So please check that out. And yeah, I hope that this was helpful for you. And I hope you have a beautiful Thursday. Okay. Aloha, everybody.